Secretary Granholm, demand for electricity is soaring. It's skyrocketing, in fact. This is happening for a number of reasons, including due to the emergence of AI, of data centers, semiconductor reshoring, clean tech manufacturing, and of course, electric vehicle use. A recent New York Times report addressed this issue and estimated that electricity demand from data centers alone, without taking into account any of those other factors, is going to triple by 2030, just in the next 6 years, using as much power as 40 million homes. Now, NERC has sounded the alarm, and NERC sounded that alarm by regarding this pending reliability crisis that's coming, due specifically to the lack of electricity supply. Demand is soaring, and it's soaring at the same time when the premature retirement of coal-fired power generation units is happening, and it's happening without replacement dispatchable generation capabilities. And so these factors have led to an over-reliance on sources like wind and solar, sources that, while clean, are entirely weather-dependent and can't give us a source of base load energy supply. Grid-scale battery technology is often touted as the answer to this, but of course grid-scale battery technology is nowhere close to being ready for deployment and use. So, Madam Secretary, do you dispute NERC's findings on this, or is it true that we have a reliability crisis looming?
We certainly have a looming demand for energy crisis, and NERC, I think, put 91 gigawatts to that by 2033 that we would have to add to account for the increase in demand.
Okay. Now, in the meantime, I'd like to get a yes or a no answer out of this one, if you can. Yes or no, does the Biden administration support a transition to net zero?
Yes.
Okay. Now, look, the basic laws of supply and demand tell us that if we don't get our act together, we'll see rolling blackouts across the country. And yet you continue to advocate for a transition, even a rapid transition, to net zero. According to a report compiled by McKinsey & Company in 2022, quote, global spending on physical assets on the course to net zero would need to reach about $275 trillion by 2050, or $9.2 trillion per year on average. Now, this factor, of course, doesn't consider the economic ripple effects that would stem from more expensive energy and energy being made less reliable. And one also has to consider the impact of lost jobs related to those same factors. It's fair to say that a net zero transition is going to require enormous sacrifice by American families, with low-income households being hit the hardest. This is deeply concerning to every American. It ought to be concerning to Americans of every background, of every political stripe. But more than anything, this isn't so much about left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, as it is rich versus poor. Rich folks can handle significant increases in the price of energy. Poor folks can't, especially when they find that increases in the price of energy spill over into literally everything they buy, into everything that they do. And when you're living at the margins like that, you're not going to be able to handle that. So, Madam Secretary, if the United States, consistent with your ambitions, with your plans, with the ambitions of the Biden administration, if it completely transitions over to get to net zero, exactly how many degrees will global temperatures decrease as a result of moving to net zero?
Well, we want to keep global temperatures from rising more than 1.5 to 2 degrees. The net zero is by 2050, so there is time to be able to get there. If we see temperatures rising greater than that, of course, the costs for poor people and for people overall because of these extreme weather events will be catastrophic.
Okay. But let's get back to my question. If we get to net zero, when we get to net zero, should we get there at some point? If we get there, what impact will that have on global temperatures?
As I say, the striving to net zero is to prevent the temperatures from rising more than 1.5 to 2 degrees.
Yeah, it's still not the answer to the question. The question is, what impact is that going to have? We've just talked about the fact that it's going to cost $275 trillion to get there. And we've talked about the fact that it's going to cost the global economy, $9 or $10 trillion a year in order to get there. So what does that buy us? What does that do? Now, you're saying, yes, we're trying to not have temperatures increase more than the defined amount that you just described. But what impact does this have? What does it do for global temperatures if we get to net zero?
Perhaps I'm not understanding your question. I think I have answered that. And the whole point is to prevent these extreme and accelerating weather events. We have had year after year of record heat. We've had year after year of increased extreme weather events just in this country.
Look, I understand the Biden administration's affinity for blaming everything, including bad weather, on Republicans and on climate change, which they always associate together. And I fail to understand how you can definitively say that a complete transition to net zero is necessary when you don't even know the impact that it would have on global temperatures. You can't tell me sitting here today what it's going to do. You tell me what you fear might happen if we don't do that. You tell me that you think temperatures will increase less if we do this than if we don't. But I don't get this, especially when, if what you're talking about is a large number, it would seem fanciful and not backed up. If it's a smaller number, it could be dismissed as a rounding error. And meanwhile, you're talking about completely changing the global economy. And given the way the United States tends to honor its legal obligations and its commitments more than other countries do, we can rest assured that it's going to cost the United States a lot more money than it is going to in a lot of places, meaning poor and middle-class Americans will suffer by far more than anyone and everyone else. I find this completely unacceptable. This is reverse Robin Hood. It's talking about stealing from the rich, stealing from the poor to give to the rich. Nobody supports that. And we can't endure it. America's poor and middle class certainly shouldn't have to shoulder this burden.
Senator Hoeven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for being here today.